This is the story of a supply chain that should not work, and has kept working for 10,000 years anyway. Somewhere between 8 and 15 million soldiers died over roughly 20 years fighting to retake a single warehouse, and the Imperium of Man called that a victory, filed the paperwork, and moved on. That contradiction, catastrophic waste sitting right next to genuine, undeniable success, is the whole story of how a million worlds get fed, armed, and marched into the guns of the enemy. What follows is an argument, not a verdict handed down by Games Workshop. It is built from the documented mechanics of Imperial logistics, the tithe, the Munitorum, the Forge Worlds, and the siege of a planet called Vraks, and it adds up to one uncomfortable thesis: the Imperium's war machine is not stable. It is a machine that has been failing successfully for 10,000 years, and the very features that keep it alive are the same features that guarantee it can never get better. Start with the scale of the problem, because the scale is the whole reason the system has to be insane in order to function. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, in the older and still used terminology, is not one army. It is a rolling levy drawn from a million worlds, a war conducted across a galaxy so large that a message from one system to the next can take months, years, sometimes centuries to arrive, if it arrives at all. There is no galactic internet. There is no real-time command. There is a bureaucracy on parchment, run by clerks who have never seen a battlefield, trying to make sure that soldiers on the far side of known space have boots, bullets, and bread. By every principle a modern logistics officer would recognize, this should be impossible. You cannot run a war with a supply chain that takes decades to close feedback loops. You cannot coordinate material across distances where the transport medium itself is a malevolent, unpredictable dimension that occasionally eats the ship. And yet guardsmen do have boots. They do have lasguns. Somewhere, a nutrient Gruel ration with a shelf life measured in centuries is sitting in a crate on a Munitorum transport, waiting for a war that hasn't started yet. The system works. That's the paradox this video sits inside, and by the end you'll understand why works and is dying are not opposites in this galaxy. They're the same sentence. To understand how any of this holds together, you have to start with the single mechanism that makes the entire edifice possible, the tithe. Every compliant world in the Imperium owes a tithe. It is not a tax in the modern sense, it's not currency changing hands, it's a levy paid in kind. Raw minerals, manufactured goods, foodstuffs, promethium fuel, and people. A world's tithe obligation is fixed by a rating system, and the rating system is worth understanding in some detail, because it tells you exactly how the Imperium thinks about the worlds it rules. A tithe grade has two parts, a class and a degree. The classes, from heaviest burden to lightest, are exactis, decuma, and solutia. Layered onto those classes are degrees, extremis, particular, prima, secundus, tertius, each one further specifying how hard a given world gets squeezed. So you get combinations like exactis extremis, the harshest possible burden a world can carry, right down through exactis prima, exactis tertius, decuma particular, that one specifically demanding a targeted resource, a particular skill set, a particular workforce, down to the lighter solutia grades, solutio extremis, solutio prima, solutio tertius. I want to be honest with you about something here, because this channel doesn't invent numbers to fill gaps. The full theoretical grid of this system, all 15 possible class and degree combinations, is implied by the structure but not confirmed as a published citable table. What we can verify is 9 specific named grades, plus one more that matters more than all the others combined. That grade is called Aptus Non. It means no tithe levied at all. And there are 2 very different reasons a world ends up there. 1. The world is incapable of paying anything because it has been sterilized by exterminatus, glassed from orbit, wiped off the ledger as a going concern. 2. The world is already rendering a service so valuable that demanding goods on top of it would be redundant. A Space Marine chapter homeworld, for instance, or a Forge world whose entire output already is the tithe. Sit with that for a second. The Imperium's own accounting system has a line item that means, in effect, this world used to exist, we killed it, there is nothing left to collect. That's not a bureaucratic footnote. That's the most honest single fact in this entire dossier. an empire that murders its own subjects on a scale beyond counting, and still keeps a formal, standardized ledger entry to record that the murder happened and the books are now, technically, balanced. Where did this system come from? Its roots go back to the Great Crusade, the founding military expansion that first stitched together the worlds that would become the Imperium. Back then, the body doing the counting was called the Corps Logisticae, the Emperor's own administrators, tasked with calculating exactly what each newly compliant world owed. Over 10,000 years, that function evolved, split, and calcified into the modern Departmento Munitorum. But here's the first crack in the foundation, and it's structural, not incidental. Assessing a world's tithe capacity, actually collecting the tithe, and auditing whether the tithe was correctly assessed in the first place are handled by separate bodies that do not necessarily talk to each other. The Departmento Exacta oversees the general imperial tithe. The Departmento Munitorum oversees the specifically military tithe, soldiers and war material. Physical collection is carried out by administratum authorities who, and this phrase is doing a lot of work, periodically arrive. Not continuously monitor, periodically arrive. The gap between one administratum visit and the next is not a small administrative delay. It is where entire worlds disappear from the system, and they do disappear. This isn't hyperbole for a documentary hook. It's a documented, structural failure mode. The administratum can lose a world outright through simple clerical error, and losing a world means, functionally, condemning it to total isolation, no aid, no contact, no acknowledgement that it exists. The administratum can also misapply a tithe grade, assign a world a burden it cannot actually bear, and then extract that burden anyway, in full technical compliance with the paperwork, asset stripping a living world into a wasteland through nothing more than an incorrect number on a form. Entire departments within the administratum have been lost and forgotten inside the organization itself, not the world's this time, the bureaucracy's own internal structure, misplaced within itself. Some of those lost departments keep functioning anyway, executing obsolete tasks nobody remembers assigning, dogmatically, purposelessly, forever. Emergency aid requests get misfiled and arrive centuries after the crisis that prompted them has already run its course, one way or another. And then there is the body whose entire function should stop your breath for a second, the Historical Revision Unit. Its job, as a matter of formal administratum policy, is to alter historical documentation deemed threatening to imperial authority, to erase planets, races, entire campaigns from the institutional record when the truth of what happened there is inconvenient. We are going to come back to that unit at the very end of this video, because it is the single most important piece of evidence for the thesis we're building. For now, just register that it exists, that it is not a conspiracy theory or a fan reading. It is a named, documented institutional function of the government that is simultaneously trying to feed and arm a war spanning 1,000,000 worlds. All of this record-keeping, the tithe grades, the collection logs, the audits, the misfilings, the outright erasures, happens on vellum, not on data slates by default, not on some galaxy-spanning digital network, actual physical parchment, maintained by untold billions of clerks, their rank displayed by the color of their robes, from black at the bottom of the hierarchy up to white at the top, in posts that are frequently hereditary. A clerk's grandson inherits his desk, his robe color, his exact administrative function, whether or not he has any aptitude for it. Now, before you write this off as simple technological backwardness, understand that it's a defensible choice within this universe's own logic. Digital systems in this galaxy are vulnerable to warp corruption, to scrap code, to hostile machine intelligences that can reach into a data network and rot it from within. Vellum can't be hacked. It can be lost. It can be misfiled. It can be eaten by moths in some archive nobody has entered in 4 centuries. But it can't be corrupted at the speed of thought by a daemon riding a data stream. That's a real trade-off, and it's worth taking seriously rather than mocking. But notice what that trade-off costs. A security posture built around resisting one kind of catastrophic failure, digital corruption, by accepting a much slower, much quieter, much more pervasive kind of failure, the simple, grinding, unglamorous failure of scale. Billions of clerks, hand copying, hand filing, hand losing the paperwork that determines whether a besieged world's cry for help ever reaches anyone who can act on it. So that's the tithe, the mechanism that decides what every world in the Imperium owes, assessed by clerks who rarely see the worlds they're grading, recorded by hand, on media designed to survive spiritual corruption at the cost of being catastrophically easy to lose. Now let's follow what happens to a tithe once it's actually collected, because the journey from a governor owes soldiers to a soldier has a rifle in his hands runs through an institution that is by its own internal culture a nightmare. That institution is the Departmento Munitorum, and the first thing you need to understand about it is what it is not. It is not a military command structure, it is a department of the Adeptus Administratum, a civilian bureaucracy handling general administration, personnel rosters, supply, and logistics for the Astra Militarum. The Imperial Guard does not command its own supply chain, it requisitions from clerks. Every rifle, every ration, every replacement boot that reaches a guard regiment passes first through the hands of an institution whose organizational instincts are administrative, not martial. An institution that thinks in forms, quotas, and precedent, not in tactical urgency. Underneath the Munitorum sit several named sub-bodies worth knowing, because each one tells you something different about how the system actually operates. The Officio Prefectus, better known as the Commissariat, is technically a Munitorum branch, tasked with overseeing the commissars who enforce discipline and loyalty in the field, up to and including summary execution of soldiers deemed cowardly, treasonous, or simply inconvenient. Sit with that for a second too. The same institutional family that decides whether a regiment gets fed also decides who gets shot for insufficient zeal. The Munitorum controls both the food and the executions. That is not a coincidence of bureaucratic filing. That is one organization holding both the carrot and the gun to the same soldiers at the same time, with minimal external check on either. Then there's a sub-body whose very existence is, I think, the single most damning piece of evidence in this entire investigation. The Officio Logisticarum, sometimes called Guilliman's Hand. It was created by Rabute Guilliman, the returned Primarch, specifically to resupply the Indomitus Crusade, his massive counter-offensive following the opening of the Great Rift. Guilliman staffed it by pulling the best logistics specialists he could find out of the existing Administratum and Munitorum structure and setting them to work in a new, parallel chain of command. Stop and think about what that decision actually says. Here is a returned demigod, a transhuman general administrator built by the Emperor himself to run the logistics of an entire crusade of conquest, looking at the 10,000-year-old machine already in place, the Departmento Munitorum, staffed by the same clerical apparatus that had in theory been perfecting its craft for 100 centuries, and deciding it could not do the job, not needs reform, not needs more staff. He built something new, next to it, staffed with people poached out of the old system, and ran his crusade through that instead. That is the Imperium's own verdict on itself, delivered by one of the few people alive with both the authority and the competence to render it. We are going to return to that moment at the end of this video, because everything else in this script is, in a sense, an explanation of why Guilliman had to make that choice. Down at the operational level, regimental quartermasters are the ones actually submitting requisition requests, trying to get bullets, boots, and bandages to soldiers who need them now. And the paperwork required to do that is bad enough, genuinely, deliberately bad enough, that an entire in-universe reference book exists just to help quartermasters navigate the forms, the Imperial Munitorum Manual. Its conceit, as a published document, is that the requisition process is complicated enough to need its own instruction manual, complete with mock forms and illustrations of administrative chaos. I want to be clear about what that means, because it's easy to read this as a joke book and move on. This is not fan speculation projected onto a serious setting. This is the setting's own authors deliberately building a documented, in-universe institution around the premise that the supply paperwork is a hostile, borderline incomprehensible obstacle course, dysfunction as a designed feature of the fictional world, not an accident of world building. And that dysfunction shows up on a soldier's plate. What does a guardsman actually eat? The standard ration is something called nutrient gruel, a grey, porridge-like substance with a shelf life of 160 standard years. Read that again. A ration designed to still be edible after a century and a half in storage. That is not a coincidence, and it is not primarily a nutritional decision, it's a supply chain decision, an admission, baked directly into the food itself, that the logistics network cannot be trusted to deliver fresh resupply on any predictable schedule, so the fallback has to survive being forgotten in a warehouse for longer than most human civilizations have existed. And yet, and this detail is almost too on the nose to be believable, except that it's documented, guardsmen are explicitly warned not to eat nutrient gruel exclusively for more than 5 consecutive days. A ration built to survive 160 years, and unsafe for a human body to survive on for even 1 week. That gap between shelf-stable for centuries and edible for 5 days is the entire Imperial logistics philosophy in miniature. Optimize for the supply chain's failure modes, not for the soldier's actual needs. Beyond the gruel there's corpse starch, a synthetic nutrient recycled from human remains, exactly as grim as it sounds, and recaf, a reconstituted caffeine stimulant that keeps exhausted soldiers on their feet. And rationing is stratified by rank. Officers receive better cuts, finer grain, richer recaf, while the enlisted eat whatever the Munitorum decided to ship that decade. Ration pack contents vary from unit to unit and shipment to shipment, and the documented reason isn't regional preference or tactical necessity, it's shortages and Munitorum mistakes. What's actually in a soldier's tin on any given day is partly a function of clerical error several jumps up the supply chain, an error that soldier will never see, trace, or have any way to correct. Getting that ration tin, along with everything else, to the front line runs through ground transport, most commonly the Cargo 8, nicknamed the Ridge Hauler or the 8-wheeler, an 18 to 40-ton hauler used interchangeably by the Guard and by civilian populations, with better equipped models carrying their own loading servitors to handle the physical labor. There's also a dedicated armored supply carrier class for moving material through contested territory. These are unglamorous machines, workhorses, and that's exactly the point. The actual physical backbone of Imperial supply isn't a wonder weapon, it's a truck. Now, here's where the story turns from documented dysfunction into something genuinely clever, because if all we had was bureaucratic failure, this system would have collapsed in its first century. It hasn't. And the reason it hasn't comes down to one specific engineering decision, hidden in plain sight in the design of the most common weapon in the Imperium's arsenal, the lasgun. There is no single, standardized Imperial lasgun. There are patterns, variants, usually named after the forge world that produces them, each tuned to different doctrines and different manufacturing traditions. The M36 Cantrell pattern is the Cadian standard, reinforced and robust, notable as the first lasgun pattern to include built-in bayonet lugs. The Acatron Mark IV is a compact bullpup design favored by the Elysian drop troops, with an integrated lamp pack that draws negligible extra power. The Lucius pattern, issued to the death corps of Krieg, hits significantly harder, roughly 21 megathols of output, at the cost of draining its power pack faster and needing extra heatsink rings to manage the additional stress. The Mars pattern equips the Talan Desert Raiders. Different weapons, different manufacturing worlds, different centuries of design history, in some cases, and here is the detail that, more than any other single fact in this dossier, explains why the Imperium's supply chain functions at all. Every one of those patterns, no matter how different the weapon itself is, draws from a standard Munitorum issue power pack, one interface, one consumable, manufactured to one specification, that fits every lasgun pattern in Imperial service, regardless of which forge world built the weapon or which century the design dates from. That is the actual engineering answer to galactic-scale logistics. You cannot standardize a weapon across 1 million worlds, 100 centuries, and thousands of independent manufacturing traditions. The attempt would collapse under its own coordination cost before the first shipment left the factory. But you can standardize the thing that has to move through the supply chain every single day, in bulk, to every front simultaneously, the power cell. Standardize the consumable, not the tool. That single choice means a Cadian shock trooper with a Cantrell pattern rifle and a Krieg grenadier with a Lucius pattern rifle can be resupplied from the exact same crate, shipped by the exact same freighter, requisitioned through the exact same clerical process, even though their weapons might as well have been designed on different planets, because they were. It's the one piece of genuine, deliberate engineering intelligence sitting inside a system otherwise built out of accumulated bureaucratic sediment, and it works precisely because it doesn't try to fix the chaos upstream, the different patterns, the different forge worlds, the different doctrines. It just makes sure the chaos converges on one predictable, fungible interface at the point of delivery. Getting materials to a forge world in the first place, and getting soldiers to the front, is its own separate ordeal, and it runs through a manpower system every bit as strange as the goods tithe. Alongside minerals and promethium, worlds owe a military tithe, and the specific mechanism is worth stating precisely, because it reveals how the burden actually gets distributed. The military tithe requires 1/10 of a planet's planetary defense force, not 1/10 of the general population, specifically 1/10 of the existing PDF, to be gathered as guard recruits. That distinction matters enormously, because it means Terra isn't running a galaxy-wide draft. Terra is billing each world for a fixed fraction of a force that world already had to raise, train and pay for on its own. The recruitment burden, the training burden, the initial equipping burden, all of it gets pushed down onto the planetary governor, off Terra's books entirely, before the Munitorum even gets involved. Collection is nominally overseen by the Munitorum, but physically executed through the same periodic administratum visits that lose entire worlds through simple neglect. And once a regiment is raised and shipped out, it does not come home. That's not written as an official Imperial policy on record. It's a characterization borne out by the pattern of how regiments are used and discarded, but it's borne out again and again across the documented history of the Astra Militarum. A tithed regiment is spent, not rotated. There is no standard regiment size, none. Some regiments number a few hundred men at founding, others field tens of thousands. Regiment is a word the Munitorum uses as if it were a fixed unit of measurement, the way an army might say division or brigade, and means something consistent, except it isn't fixed at all. It varies by 2 full orders of magnitude from one regiment to the next, and a centralized supply system that requisitions material by regiment, calculated against a term that can mean 300 men or 30,000, depending on which world raised it, is a system that is structurally guaranteed to misallocate. Not occasionally, structurally. Every single time a quota gets calculated using per regiment as the unit, somebody downstream gets too much or, far more often, too little. Moving all these variably sized regiments across a galaxy is the Imperial Navy's job, and the ships doing it are frequently doing double duty. Heavy transports serve simultaneously as troop carriers and as bulk freighters for ore, promethium and grain. The exact same hull, refitted, might carry a regiment of guardsmen on one voyage, and a cargo of grain on the next. Forces get dispatched, redeployed, and evacuated on what amounts to a daily basis across the breadth of the Imperium, and every single one of those movements is subject to warp transit, a mode of travel that adds delay nobody can predict or control, sometimes minutes, sometimes centuries, sometimes total loss with no trace, which means any Imperial supply plan, however carefully drafted, is not actually a schedule. It's a probability distribution. Command can request that reinforcements arrive by a certain date. They cannot know it. And when the manpower runs out anyway, when a besieged force needs replacements faster than a shattered world can produce them, the system's answer is worth sitting with. Take the death curve of Krieg at the siege we're about to spend the rest of this video inside. Krieg itself functions as a dedicated feeder world, shipping fresh troops directly into the grinder to replace the dead, an entire planet's population treated as a standing replacement reservoir for one theater of war. But when a world can't meet its manpower quota, when the tithe takers arrive and the numbers simply aren't there to give, the documented Imperial response is not investigation, not adjusted expectations, not aid. Munitorum tithe takers report the shortfall, and the result, in multiple recorded cases, has been the summary execution of the governors responsible. Several dozen of them, at minimum. The system's answer to, "We don't have the soldiers you're demanding," is to kill the person who told you that, not to ask why the soldiers aren't there. Think about what that does to the information flowing back up the chain. If reporting a shortfall gets you executed, the rational move, The only survivable move for every governor in the Imperium is to never, ever report a shortfall. Pad the numbers, send what you have, and call it enough. Let the frontline unit discover the gap themselves, months or years later, far from any governor who might be blamed for it. We're going to come back to this, because it's one of the central mechanisms of the thesis this whole video is built around. A system that punishes accurate bad news guarantees that every number flowing up its chain is optimistic by an unknown, unmeasurable margin. Nobody in this system can trust their own ledgers, and the system itself made sure of it. On training, I want to be straightforward with you, rather than invent something that sounds tidier than the truth. There is no Imperium-wide guard training standard, no fixed schedule, no fixed duration. That's not an oversight in this research. It's a canon blank, and the honest answer is that training quality is simply whatever the tithed world happens to provide. Some worlds produce elite, battle-hardened regiments from birth, feral worlds where every child learns to kill before they learn to read. Others hand over conscripted laborers who've never held a weapon and get perhaps a few weeks of drilling before shipping out. The closest thing to a universal imperial document on soldiering is the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer, and it is, by design, a propaganda pamphlet, not a training manual. It teaches loyalty and fear of the alien and the mutant far more than it teaches marksmanship. And how many people, in total, does the Astra Militarum actually field? I'm not going to give you a number, because there isn't a verifiable one. You'll hear trillions thrown around across fan spaces, and it might even be roughly right, but there is no published, citable headcount for the total Astra Militarum. The honest answer is, nobody, including the administratum itself, actually knows the number. And I'd argue that's not a gap in the research. That is itself the point. A war machine spanning 1 million worlds, run by an institution obsessed with ledgers and quotas and vellum records, cannot tell you how many soldiers it currently has under arms, not because the number is classified, because the number is unknowable, given how the system is built. Which brings us to the place where every thread in this video converges, the case study that turns all of this abstract dysfunction into a specific, documented, decades-long catastrophe. The Siege of Vraks. Vraks Prime, sourced from Forge World's Imperial Armor Siege of Vraks campaign books, was a Departmento Munitorum armory and depot world. That's the crucial fact to hold on to before anything else. Vraks was not a capital. It was not a population center of unusual size or strategic industry. Its value to the Imperium was almost entirely logistical. It was a warehouse, a storage and distribution node feeding munitions to regiments across the Scarus sector and beyond. When Vraks fell into heresy, when its population rose in rebellion under a corrupted cardinal, the Imperium did not simply write the world off, the way it apparently has with countless other lost worlds elsewhere in this dossier. It committed to a decades-long siege to take it back. The Imperium fought one of the longest, bloodiest campaigns in its recorded history to recapture a warehouse. The numbers involved are staggering, and I want to flag clearly which of them are solid and which are secondary analysis, because this channel doesn't blur that line. The population at the outbreak of the rebellion was 8 million people. That figure is secure. Of the labor population on Vraks, 1 in 4 volunteered for, or was conscripted into, the rebel cardinal's militia, turning a supply depot's own workforce into the army the Imperium would have to grind down to get its warehouse back. To sustain the siege, the Munitorum deployed a labor corps of 500,000 men, drawn specifically from the penal colonies of Arfista, whose job was to lay railway lines across barren, hostile wilderness just to keep the siege logistics moving, a supply chain built, in real time, entirely to support the effort of retaking a supply chain. The siege was planned to run 12 standard years. That planned duration is also secure, straight from the source material. The casualty and total duration figures are where I need to be careful with you, because they come from third-party analysis rather than a single confirmed primary count. But the widely cited estimate is somewhere in the range of 14 to 15 million guardsmen dead over roughly 20 years of actual fighting, alongside the destruction of 9 Titans, the deaths of more than 500 Space Marines, and the loss of an Imperial Navy cruiser. Read that again slowly. Between 8 and 15 million soldiers dead, more people than live in some entire nations on Earth, fighting for 2 decades, to retake one Munitorum depot world, not to defend the Imperium's capital, not to hold a strategic chokepoint against Xenos invasion, to take back a warehouse that seceded because the system meant to administer it failed to keep it loyal in the first place. And here is the part where I think you have to hold two completely opposite readings of the same event in your head at once, because both are true. Read 1. The Siege of Vraks is the single greatest logistics achievement documented in this entire research. The Imperium sustained an active besieging force, hundreds of thousands of laborers, millions of guardsmen, armor, titans, an entire naval presence, on a devastated, dying world for 2 decades, and at the end of it, they won. That is not a small thing. That is a supply chain functioning, under sustained combat conditions, across 20 years, at a scale most modern militaries could not conceive of attempting. Read 2, running in the exact opposite direction. The entire war existed only because the system that was supposed to keep Vraks compliant, keep it fed, keep its population loyal and supplied, failed catastrophically enough that the world seceded in the first place, and by the time the Imperium finished retaking it, the warehouse itself, the entire strategic reason for fighting the war, had been effectively destroyed in the process of winning it back. The Imperium's greatest logistics triumph and its greatest logistics indictment are the same 20 years, on the same dead world, and you cannot tell this story honestly by picking only one of those readings. I'll flag one more thing here, because the research is honest about its limits and you should be too. I found no specific documented world in this research where a famine is directly and explicitly attributed, on the record, to Administratum or Munitorum failure. The mechanism for how that would happen, misapplied tithe grades stripping a world's productive capacity, aid requests misfiled for centuries, emergency relief arriving generations too late to matter, all of that is thoroughly documented as a structural pattern. What's missing is a named victim, a specific world where all of that machinery is shown converging on a starving population in a single, citable account. I'd rather tell you that gap exists than invent a name to fill it. The mechanism is real. The specific casualty, in the sources available to this research, is not named. So how does any of this actually work? How does a system this riddled with documented, structural, repeatedly recurring failure sustain a war effort across 1 million worlds for 10,000 years without simply collapsing? I think there are 5 mechanisms doing the load-bearing work, and once you see them laid out together, the shape of the whole machine snaps into focus. First, standardized consumables, not standardized weapons. We already walked through this with the lasgun, Cantrell, Acatron, Lucius, Mars, entirely different rifles built on entirely different forge worlds across different centuries, all drawing from the same Munitorum issue power pack. The Imperium doesn't try to force 1 million worlds worth of independent manufacturing traditions into one uniform weapon. It just makes sure the one thing that has to flow through the supply chain constantly, in bulk, everywhere, is interchangeable. That single decision absorbs an enormous amount of chaos before it ever has to be resolved centrally. Second, decentralized production with zero central dependency. Forge worlds are sovereign mechanicus territory. They're rated Aptus Non precisely because their output is the tithe. They don't pay into the system. They are the system's productive core, and they're self-financing, self-supplying, answerable to their own religious technical hierarchy rather than to a Terran production quota. That means there is no single point of failure in Imperial manufacturing, because there was never a single point of control to begin with. If Mars burned tomorrow, and elsewhere in the timeline, Forge worlds have burned, Riser keeps making plasma weapons, Lucius keeps hollowing out its underground factories, Cantrell keeps stamping out rifles. The redundancy isn't a contingency plan, it's the default operating structure. Third, the tithe pushes the hard problem down a level, and then down again, endlessly. Terra does not recruit soldiers, Terra does not train them, Terra bills a planetary governor for 1/10 of his existing planetary defense force, and lets him figure out the rest, recruitment, training, initial equipping, all of it delegated downward, off Terra's books, audited only at the point of output. That's the pattern of the entire tithe system, goods and manpower alike. Don't solve the problem centrally, delegate it 1 million times over, in parallel, to 1 million local administrators who each only have to solve their own tiny fragment of it. Fourth, and this is the one I think most people underestimate, ritual is quality control. Remember the standard template construct system, dark age of technology era blueprint databases containing the instructions for building practically anything a colony might need, technology so far beyond the current Imperium's understanding that fully functional STC systems are practically unknown in the present era. What survives, in the rare cases where anything survives at all, are printouts, fragments of instructions, treated as holy scripture rather than engineering documentation. Magos Archon Land, recovering STC fragments back in the 31st millennium, found the blueprints for the Land Raider and the Land Speeder, vehicles that bear his name today not because he designed them, but because he found them, and nobody since has understood them well enough to improve on a single rivet. That's the production model underlying huge swaths of Imperial manufacturing, replicate the recovered instructions exactly, forever, precisely because nobody comprehends why they work. The ritual isn't decorative theater layered on top of the real engineering process. The ritual is the quality assurance system, a procedure nobody can debug, gets preserved word for word, and sanctified specifically so that no one is ever tempted to improvise, to improve a step whose actual function nobody understands, and thereby break something they can't fix. That's how a semi-literate tech priest on a hollowed-out forge world, following a memorized litany rather than an engineering education, mass-produces a working lasgun that will fire reliably for a soldier 1,000 light-years away who he will never meet. Fifth, redundancy of scale. 15 million dead at Vraks over 20 years sounds, and is, an almost incomprehensible atrocity. Set against the Imperium's total population, it's a rounding error. Efficiency, the relentless optimization modern logistics obsesses over, squeezing waste out of every link in a supply chain, is a discipline that only becomes necessary under scarcity. The Imperium, for all its internal dysfunction, has never actually operated under scarcity of the one resource its entire system is calibrated to burn through fastest, human lives. When your fundamental strategic resource is functionally inexhaustible, an enormous amount of institutional waste simply stops mattering, because there's always more where that came from. The Gruel with the 160-year shelf life isn't really a triumph of chemistry. It's the physical expression of an institution that has fully internalized the assumption that its own supply chain will fail, and has built its entire logistics philosophy around surviving that failure rather than preventing it. Put those 5 mechanisms together, and you get an honest, if uncomfortable answer to the paradox we opened with. This system does not work despite the waste. It works because the waste is the strategy. Delegation instead of central planning, redundant sovereign production instead of a single supply hub, ritual instead of engineering literacy, surplus instead of accuracy. None of those are solutions to the Imperium's logistics problem in the sense a modern supply chain consultant would recognize as a solution. They're all ways of not having to solve the problem, of routing around the need for real-time accuracy, real-time coordination, and centralized control, because the galaxy this Imperium operates in makes all 3 of those things effectively impossible to achieve at scale in the first place. But, and this is where the video has to stop admiring the machine and start being honest about it, every one of those 5 mechanisms carries a cost, and the cost is the same cost, expressed 5 different ways. This system cannot correct itself. It can only survive its own errors by outlasting them, go back through the case against, one piece at a time. Vraks, a Munitorum depot, lost to secession, took 20 years and something between 8 and 15 million lives to recapture, and by the end, the strategic asset it existed to protect was gone anyway. That's not a story about resilience. That's a story about a fire that took 2 decades to put out because nobody built the building to resist catching fire in the first place. Aid arriving centuries late. For any world experiencing an acute crisis right now, this instant, the Imperium is functionally absent, not slow, absent, because by the time a response could theoretically arrive, the crisis that prompted it, and possibly the population that suffered it, no longer exists in any form the response could help. Misapplied tithe grades, the machine, through nothing more dramatic than clerical error, consumes its own future productive capacity, strip mining a compliant world down to nothing because a form was filled out wrong 3 departments away, and nobody catches it because the assessing body and the auditing body don't reconcile with each other. Executed governors. The system's answer to a manpower shortfall is to kill the messenger, which means every governor from that point forward has a direct survival incentive to make sure his numbers always look fine, whether or not they actually are, guaranteeing that the administratum's own ledgers, the only tool it has for understanding the true state of its own empire, are permanently, structurally, unknowably optimistic. And Guilliman's Officio Logisticarum, the parallel supply agency a returned Primarch felt he had no choice but to build from scratch. That is not a footnote. That is the Imperium's own most competent living administrator looking at 10,000 years of accumulated Munitorum practice and concluding that the correct response wasn't reform, it was triage, route around it. Build something new next to the broken thing, because the broken thing is beyond saving. Notice the shape of what's happening across every one of these failures. It is always the same failure, wearing different clothes. Information does not travel accurately, and the system has no mechanism to force it to. Not insufficient technology, not the warp makes communication hard, although it does. The deeper problem is that the institution has built-in specific, active incentives against accurate reporting, punish the governor who tells the truth about a shortfall, and erase the campaigns and worlds whose history is inconvenient to remember. So even where the technology to communicate exists, the truth increasingly doesn't survive the trip. Which is why I keep coming back to the historical revision unit, and why I think it's the single most important piece of evidence in this entire dossier. Every institution eventually makes mistakes. Every empire in history has lost battles, lost worlds, misjudged its own strength. What makes the Imperium different, what makes this specific empire's failure mode so distinct, is that it maintains a standing, named, funded bureaucratic body whose entire job is to make sure those mistakes cannot be studied, learned from, or even remembered. A living organism that felt pain would flinch away from whatever caused it, and, over time, adapt. An organism that anesthetizes the nerve and deletes the memory of the injury cannot adapt to anything. It can only keep making the same mistake, indefinitely, because as far as its own institutional memory is concerned, the mistake never happened. That is the honest synthesis this research points toward, and I want to say clearly one more time, this is analysis, an argument built from documented mechanics, not a verdict Games Workshop has ever officially handed down, but the argument I think holds. The Imperium's logistics network survives by working through its own waste rather than despite it, substituting overwhelming surplus for accuracy, decentralized redundancy for central coordination, sanctified ritual for actual understanding, and delegated responsibility for direct control. Every one of those substitutions genuinely works, in the narrow sense that the Imperium is still standing, 10,000 years on, still moving soldiers and supplies across 1,000,000 worlds, still winning wars it has no right to be able to fight at this scale. But every one of those same substitutions also removes, piece by piece, the system's ability to notice, measure, and correct its own decline. It cannot measure decline, because the instrument that would do the measuring, the tithe ledgers, the requisition reports, the governor's returns, is the same instrument that punishes anyone who reports bad news honestly, and it cannot learn from decline, because the institution charged with remembering what happened is also, by explicit policy, charged with erasing whatever it finds too dangerous to remember. So, is the Imperium's war machine stable? I'd argue no. I'd argue it looks stable only because the rate of decline is slower than any single human lifespan can perceive, spread across 10,000 years and 1,000,000 worlds, absorbed by a surplus of human life so vast that 15 million dead on one dead-end world barely moves the needle. It is not a machine holding steady, it is a machine falling, very, very slowly, cushioned at every level by waste it has learned to treat as a feature rather than a symptom. Standardized power packs instead of standardized weapons, sovereign forge worlds instead of central factories, unquestioned ritual instead of dangerous understanding, delegated tithes instead of central planning, and an endless, self-renewing supply of soldiers to spend against the gap between what the ledgers say and what's actually true. It has been failing since the day it was built, and it has been succeeding at that failure for 10,000 years, and those two facts are not in tension, they are the same fact, looked at from two different distances. The Imperium doesn't need to fix Vraks. It only needs the next Vraks to cost it slightly less than the last one bought it. And for 10,000 years, brutally, wastefully, at a cost measured in tens of millions of lives per generation, that has been exactly enough.